The air at the edge of the world was thin and sharp, tasting of stone and distance. Elias Vance, a man whose hair held more silver than the rivers he had crossed, drew his woolen poncho tighter around his shoulders and watched the sun bleed its final colors across the western peaks of the Andes. Below him the world fell away into a deep, shadowed valley, a place where the last vestiges of civilization frayed into the untamed green of the Amazon basin. For weeks he had been climbing, leaving behind the clamor of port towns and the dust of well-trodden paths. Now there was only the wind for company, a lonely voice that whispered through the spires of rock and the hardy, low-lying shrubs. His quest was not for gold, not in the way the conquistadors had sought it. Theirs was a hunger of the fist, a violent, grasping need to possess. His was a hunger of the soul, a quiet, persistent yearning to understand. He sought not the metal, but the myth. El Dorado, the Gilded Man, a story that had echoed for centuries, a shimmer on the horizon of human imagination. In his worn leather satchel, beside his carefully preserved maps and his charcoal sticks, was a journal filled not with calculations of wealth, but with fragments of poetry, sketches of birds he could not name, and questions directed at the ghosts of this land. He was searching for the source of a dream. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the jagged horizon, a single brilliant star pricked the deepening indigo of the sky. It reminded him of a story he had read, an account from a long-dead friar who wrote of the Muisca people and their reverence for the heavens. He closed his eyes, the cold air crisp against his weathered skin, and let the wind carry him back, not in space, but in time. The air was not cold, but cool and heavy, with the scent of burning copal resin and damp earth. It was the hour before dawn, a time of sacred stillness. The people of Bacata were gathered, their forms like shadows on the shore of the great lake, Guatavita. The lake was a perfect circle, a celestial eye gazing up at the cosmos, its surface a dark, unblinking mirror. In the center of the silent crowd a space was cleared. Here, the Zipa, the new chieftain, stood as still as the mountains that cradled the lake. He was a young man, but his face held the ancient gravity of his ancestors. He was not yet a king. He was a vessel, an offering waiting to be prepared. The priests, the *Jeques*, moved around him with a slow, deliberate grace. Their movements were a prayer in themselves. One carried a gourd filled with a sticky, sweet-smelling resin, which he began to anoint the Zipa's body with, painting him from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. The resin was a promise, a sacred adhesive that would soon bind him to the sun. Another priest followed, holding a hollowed-out tube of bamboo. He dipped the tube into a wide, shallow bowl filled with the finest gold dust, as fine as pollen, as bright as a captured star. He brought the tube to his lips, and with a soft, controlled breath, he blew a shimmering cloud onto the Zipa's resin-coated skin. Again and again, he did this. A breath, a cloud of gold. A breath, a shimmer of light. The people watched in reverent silence, their breath held in unison. With each exhalation from the priest, the Zipa was transformed. His human form began to disappear, limb by limb, feature by feature, dissolving into a living statue of pure, radiant light. He was no longer a man of flesh and blood. He was becoming a child of the sun, a promise to the gods who lived in the water and the sky. He was becoming El Dorado. Elias awoke with a start, though nothing had disturbed the silence of his small camp. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, pulsing like a slow, sleeping heart. The dream or vision had been so vivid he could almost still smell the sweet, smoky incense. He reached for his journal, his fingers stiff with cold, and by the faint light of the embers and the brilliant moon he began to write. The gold was not a decoration. He wrote, his charcoal scratching softly in the immense silence. It was a sacrament, a form of dissolution. To cover oneself in it was not an act of vanity, but of surrender. They were not flaunting wealth, they were returning a gift. The sun gives its light to the earth, which grows the maize. The earth gives its gold, which is returned to the gods. It is a cycle, a conversation. The men who came here with their swords and their crosses, they could not hear this conversation. They only heard the clatter of coin. He looked up from the page. out at the vast, sleeping landscape. The mountains were monstrous silhouettes against a sky so clear it felt as if you could fall upwards into it forever. He felt impossibly small, a fleeting speck of warmth and thought in a world of ancient, cold stone. And yet, he did not feel alone. The story was here, woven into the fabric of the place. He was not a discoverer, but a listener. The next days were a slow, arduous rhythm of walking. He descended from the high, barren peaks into the ***, the land of mist and strange, towering plants called fralajones. These plants, with their furry, silvery leaves and crowns of yellow flowers, stood like silent sentinels in the swirling gray fog. The world here was soft-edged and quiet. The ground, a spongy carpet of moss and peat, muffled his footsteps so that he felt he was moving through a dream. The mist was a constant companion. It would roll in without warning, erasing the path before him and the world behind, leaving him suspended in a white, featureless void. In these moments, disorientation was a danger, but Elias found a strange peace in it. The loss of direction forced him to rely on other senses. He could feel the gentle slope of the land beneath his boots, smell the subtle shift in the air that suggested water nearby, hear the distant, mournful cry of a curlew, a sound that seemed to be the very voice of solitude. He found himself thinking less and less of his life back home, of the dusty libraries and the polite academic debates. That world seemed abstract, unreal. This was real. The damp chill that seeped into his bones, the ache in his muscles, the raw, unfiltered beauty of a landscape that had no need for human admiration. He was being stripped down, layer by layer, just as the Zipa had been stripped of his human form. One afternoon, as the mist thinned to a silvery haze, he stopped to rest beside a small, dark tarn, its water as still and black as polished obsidian. He knelt at its edge and saw his reflection, a gaunt, bearded stranger with eyes that seemed to hold the vast emptiness of the **Paramo** within them. As he splashed the icy water on his face, his fingers brushed against something smooth and hard beneath the moss at the water's edge. He gently cleared the vegetation away and found a small, stylized figure no bigger than his thumb, wrought from a dark, heavy alloy of gold and copper. A **Tunjo. An offering. It was a simple, flat figure, a warrior or a priest, with empty eyes and outstretched arms. It was not a treasure of immense value, but it felt more precious than a room full of bullion. It was a whisper from the past, a tangible piece of the story he was chasing. He held it in his palm, its cold metal slowly warming to his touch, and closed his eyes. The raft was waiting. It was not a grand vessel, but a simple, sturdy construction of logs, bound tightly with jungle vines. Its surface, however, was a tapestry of offerings. Woven blankets of the most vibrant colors, piles of emeralds like chips of green fire, and dozens of golden **Tunjos*, each one a unique prayer shaped by a hopeful hand. In the center of the raft, a brazier smoldered, releasing a thick, fragrant plume of copal smoke that rose straight into the windless pre-dawn air. The gilded man, now fully encased in his armor of light, walked towards the shore. His movements were slow, weighted not just by the gold but by the expectations of his people and the gravity of the ritual. He did not shine like polished metal. He glowed with a soft, warm luminescence, as if he had swallowed the sun and it was now radiating from within. The four highest priests, their faces painted with the symbols of the jaguar, the snake, the condor, and the frog, followed him. They stepped onto the raft. The crowd on the shore let out a collective, sighing breath, a sound like the rustling of 1,000 leaves. There were no cheers, no shouts. This was not a coronation, it was a pilgrimage. With long poles, 2 of the priests pushed the raft away from the land. It glided out onto the dark, still water, a small island of light and smoke moving towards the heart of the sacred lake. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water against the logs and the distant, ethereal notes of a bone flute, played by a musician hidden somewhere in the crowd. The music was not a melody, but a series of rising and falling tones that seemed to mimic the breathing of the mountains. The raft moved towards the center of the lake, the place where the water was deepest, where the boundary between the world of men and the world of the goddess Guatavita was at its thinnest. The gilded man stood at the prow, his golden form reflected perfectly in the black mirror of the water, so that it seemed another sun god was rising from the depths to meet him. Elias placed the small Tunjo back where he had found it, tucking the moss gently around it. It was not his to take. It belonged to this place, to the silence and the mist. His journey continued, a slow descent from the otherworldly Paramo into the upper reaches of the cloud forest. The world grew loud again. The oppressive silence was replaced by a symphony of life. The dripping of water from enormous, waxy leaves, the chittering of unseen insects, the bizarre, percussive calls of oropendola birds from their hanging nests. The air grew thick and humid, heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying flowers. He followed a stream, its water clear and cold, as it tumbled down the mountainside, carving a path through the dense green. This, according to his oldest map, was the stream that fed the sacred lake. He was getting closer. The anticipation in his chest was not a feverish excitement, but a deep, calm resonance, as if a bell had been struck within him and was now humming softly. He thought of the men who had come before him: Quesada, Belalcazar, Fetterman. Their names were like scars on the history of this land. They had come with armies, with horses and harquebuses, tearing through the jungle, torturing natives for information, driven mad by the rumor of a city paved with gold. They had even tried to drain the lake, once with a bucket chain of thousands of laborers, another time by cutting a great notch in the crater's rim. They had found some gold, yes, but they had never found the city. They had never found what they were truly looking for, because they had never understood what it was. They were searching for a place on a map, a vault to be emptied. Elias knew, with a certainty that had settled deep in his bones, that El Dorado was not a place. It was a ritual. It was a poem. After 2 more days of pushing through the thick, tangled undergrowth, the forest suddenly opened up. He stood at the edge of a clearing, and there it was. Lake Guatavita. It was more beautiful and more simple than any legend could describe. It was a perfect, steep-sided crater, a bowl of emerald green hills holding a circle of impossible turquoise water. The sun was high, and the surface of the lake glittered with a light so intense it was hard to look at. There was no city. There were no golden temples, no paved streets. There was only the lake, the sky, and the profound, ringing silence of the mountains. Elias felt no disappointment. He felt a sense of arrival, of homecoming. He slowly walked down the grassy slope to the water's edge. He had imagined this moment for years, but the reality of it was quieter, more personal. He took off his pack and sat on the shore, simply looking. He watched the way the wind made fleeting patterns on the water's surface, like a ghostly finger tracing forgotten symbols. He watched the clouds drift across the sky, their reflections sailing silently across the depths. He made his camp there, on the shore of the lake. He did not search, he did not dig, he waited. He felt that the story was not something to be uncovered, but something to be received. He spent his days walking the perimeter of the crater, sketching the contours of the hills, observing the way the light changed on the water from the pearly gray of dawn to the fiery gold of sunset. He spent his evenings by his small fire reading his journal, adding new thoughts, new questions. He was no longer an explorer in a foreign land, he was a pilgrim at a shrine. One night, the moon was full. It rose above the lip of the crater, enormous and white, and poured its liquid silver light into the bowl of the lake. The world was bleached of color, rendered in shades of silver and black. The water was a polished disk of light, and the silence was so complete, so absolute that Elias could hear the thrumming of his own blood in his ears. He felt the veil between worlds grow thin once more, and as he stared, mesmerized, at the moon's reflection, the vision returned, clearer and more complete than ever before. The raft was motionless in the exact center of the lake. The sun had just begun to touch the tops of the surrounding peaks, setting them ablaze with pink and orange light. The time had come. The gilded man raised his arms to the rising sun, a gesture of greeting and offering. The first rays of light struck his golden body, and for a moment he became unbearably bright, a figure of pure incandescence, a second, smaller sun, born on the water. A deep, resonant hum began from the crowd on the shore, a sound that was part prayer, part incantation. It was the sound of the earth itself. As the hum grew in volume, the priests on the raft began the offerings. One by one, they lifted the emeralds, the asterisk tunjos asterisk, the precious things, and with a murmur of thanks they cast them into the lake. There was no splash, it seemed. The objects simply vanished into the dark water, swallowed by the goddess. Each offering sent ripples across the mirrored surface, distorting the reflection of the gilded man, making him waver and dance. He was returning the earth's gifts to the water, which would in turn bless the earth, ensuring the rains would come, the maize would grow, and the people would prosper. It was a cosmic transaction, a balancing of accounts between the human and the divine. The gold was not a payment. It was a symbol of the sun's energy, a solidified piece of light being given back to its source. When the last offering had been given, a profound silence fell once more. The gilded man stood alone at the prow. He looked at the sun, then down at the water. He was the bridge between the sky and the depths. Then, in a single fluid motion, he dove. He entered the water with a clean, soft splash. The sacred, icy cold of the lake enveloped him. He sank into the darkness, the silence of the deep. The water began to dissolve the resin, and the gold dust, the prayer of his people, was released. It clouded the water around him in a swirling, glittering nebula, a galaxy of tiny suns being born and dying in the dark. He was washing the god away, returning the light to the goddess, becoming a man once more. As he kicked towards the surface, he was cleansed, reborn. He broke through the surface with a gasp, no longer a golden deity, but a man of flesh and blood, the Zipa of his people, his leadership consecrated not by a crown of gold placed upon his head, but by a fortune of it washed from his body. The cycle was complete. Elias blinked. The moon was high overhead, its light cool and serene. The vision had faded, but the understanding it brought remained, clear and solid as a stone in his hand. El Dorado was not lost. It could never be lost, because it was not a place. It was an idea. It was the belief that the greatest wealth is not what you keep, but what you give away. It was a story about renewal, about the sacred conversation between humanity and the world it inhabits. The conquistadors, in their violent, desperate search, had been like men trying to catch the reflection of the moon in a net. The more they thrashed and struggled, the more they broke the very thing they were trying to capture. The treasure was not in the lake. It was in the act of giving to the lake. For another week Elias remained, but his quest was over. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet joy that was more fulfilling than any discovery of gold could ever be. He had come seeking the truth behind a myth, and he had found it. The truth was not a fact, but a meaning. On his last morning, he stood at the water's edge as the dawn broke. The mist hovered over the lake, and the first rays of sun turned it to a shimmering golden haze. For a fleeting moment, the entire surface of the lake seemed to glow, as if the offerings of centuries were rising to greet the new day. Elias smiled. He shouldered his pack, which felt lighter than it had in months. He took one last look at the beautiful, silent lake, a place that held its secrets not in its depths, but in its very existence. He turned and began the long walk, back to a world that would never understand what he had found. He filled the final page of his journal that night, camped in the cloud forest, the sounds of the living world a comforting chorus around him. Asterisk, they will continue to search. Asterisk, he wrote. Asterisk, they will come with their machines and their charts, and they will dredge the mud for the last flecks of a dream. They will never find it. Because the real El Dorado is not a city of gold. It is a man covered in dust, standing on a raft at dawn. It is a prayer for renewal. It is a story whispered by the wind in the high Paramo and reflected in the silent water of a sacred lake. Some treasures are not meant to be found. They are meant to be sought. Their power, their beauty lies not in their possession but in their endless, shimmering distance. He closed the book. The legend was safe. It was safe not in a vault or a museum, but in the heart of the mountains, and in the quiet understanding of a man who had learned to listen. He lay back, his head on his pack, and looked up through the canopy at the stars, those distant, untouchable jewels. He closed his eyes, and with the gentle rhythm of the forest breathing around him, he fell into a deep and dreamless sleep.